Hey there, good to have you with us today. We've got a really great show on the combat patches of the Army Air Force in World War II. And you better believe that the Army Air Force saw a lot of combat. We're going to take a look at all of the numbered Air Force and how the United States Air Force today still uses those insignia in many of their current commands. Hello, good to have you with us today. Welcome to Veterans Medals Workshop. I'm your host, Frank Foster, and today we've got a really great show. We're going to talk about the combat patches of the United States Army Air Force in World War II. And special thanks to Medals of America and Fountain Inn for providing all the patches, and most especially to Peter Morgan for the use of the patches from his book, Military Patches of the United States. It has all of the patches you're going to see today, plus several hundred more Army Air Force patches among, well, the 5,000 U.S. military patches in the book. The Army Air Corps goes back to, well, around 1907 when it got first started in the Signal Corps. It later became the Aeronautical Division, and then in 1926 it was designated the Army Air Corps. At the beginning of World War II, the Army Air Corps had maybe 30,000 officers and air cadets and maybe 250, 260,000 enlisted personnel, maybe 300,000 personnel in the Army Air Corps at the beginning of World War II, and maybe 10,000 aircraft. By the end of World War II, in 1945, there were 2.8 million Americans serving in the Army Air Corps, and well over 50% of them were deployed in combat overseas. They went from 10,000 airplanes to receiving over 300,000 aircraft from American production facilities. They inflicted losses on the enemy of over 40,000 aircraft. They suffered over 22,000 aircraft losses for various causes on combat sorties. They had the highest losses of officers that you can imagine. Over 50,000 officers and warrant officers were either killed in action, seriously wounded, captured, or still missing in action. And over 68,000 Air Force enlisted personnel were killed in action. Their losses only second to the infantry. So it was incredible what they performed. And we'll take a look at how each one of those individually numbered Air Forces contributed to the overall United States Army Air Force in World War II. I think you'll enjoy it. And please, if you enjoy these shows, give us a like, and even better, subscribe. It really, really helps keep us on the air. So, okay, let's go take a look. But I've got maybe one more thing to show you before we do. Okay, let's go. I just want to give you an example here of an Army Air Force enlisted man who's coming home from the war. He's been assigned, his last assignment was at General Headquarters in Washington, D.C. He has his aircrew wings, his ribbons for showing service in Europe, his discharge badge. He shows his combat patch on the right sleeve where he served with the airborne troop carriers, and his unit citations on his lower right sleeve. Now, these patches disappear in 1947 because the Air Force quit wearing shoulder sleeve insignia. They didn't get the new uniform till a little later, but you wouldn't have any more patches. The orange and blue patch in the lower left-hand corner was the General Headquarters Air Force patch approved in 1937, and it had 3 impeller blades representing the striking elements of the Air Corps, which were originally organized into 3 wings. In 1942, though, a new patch was approved for the Army Air Force for all personnel assigned to the Army Air Force to wear. It was an ultramarine blue disc representing the sky and the air, and the white star and red disc had been the identifying symbol of U.S. Army airplanes since its inception. The gold wings above the star were a symbol of victory. The patch you see in the center was a sort of like interim before they came out and put the red disc in the center of the star. Just an interesting little sidebar. General Hap Arnold became the commander of the Army Air Force, and in this photograph he is wearing the first military aviator badge issued by the Army in 1913. You don't see that very often. This Staff Sergeant of the Army Air Force proudly displays his patch in the upper right-hand corner for his service with an aviation engineering battalion. He was probably building the runways for the planes to land and take off on. But he's done a nice job with his case, and you can see his pride of service. The 1st Air Force, shown here, was activated in April of 1941 and was responsible for the air defense of the northeast continental United States. It first engaged in extensive anti-submarine operations after the United States entered the war. And then, when the Submarine Command was activated in 1943, the 1st Air Force switched over to activate, train, and stage over 350 combat units from 1942 to 1944. The 1st Air Force shoulder patch was actually approved in January 1944 and is basically the Army Air Force patch with the numeral 1 representing the unit's designation. Today, the 1st Air Force is located in Tyndall Air Force Base, Florida, with the primary mission of air defense. The 2nd Air Force was activated in 1941 with headquarters at Fort George Wright near Spokane, Washington, and charged with the defense of the West Coast. It was later transferred to Colorado Springs and became primarily a training unit for 14,000 heavy bomber crews sent to Europe, and then later concentrated on the B-29 Super Fortress program. The shoulder patch, the falcon, represents the trained servant of man as well as the planet, which is represented on the insignia by the Army Air Force Star. The falcon is an intelligently controlled force of destruction in the air and on the ground, and symbolizes the elements of fighter and bombardment groups which make up the 2nd Air Force. It's also interesting to note that the falcon is the symbol of the Air Force Academy. Today, the 2nd Air Force is responsible for conducting basic military and technical training for Air Force enlisted personnel and non-flying officers. Here is a really personalized 2nd Air Force display case of a flight engineer. He's got his B-29 up in the left-hand corner, a great picture of it. He's gone through a lot of trouble to have his Army Air Force patch done in bullion and his 2nd Air Force patch done in gold bullion. It goes together really well. What a beautifully unique and balanced case for this veteran. The 3rd Air Force was activated in April 1941 with headquarters in Tampa, Florida, and it covered the Southeast Air District and conducted over 1,000 anti-submarine patrols until its basic mission became that of training pilots, bombardiers, navigators, flight engineers, and radar observers, as well as a number of aerial gunners. The patch itself is a winged star that is symbolic of the Army Air Forces and the Arabic numeral 3, which indicates the unit designation. Today, the 3rd Air Force is headquartered in Ramstein Air Base, Germany, and is responsible for all U.S. Air Forces in Europe and Africa. It was activated in April 1941 with headquarters at March Field, California, and responsible for the air defense, the Western Defense Command, and in that capacity flew a lot of long-range Pacific patrol missions. But as the threat from the Japanese lessened, it became a major training unit at over 20 bases in the western states and provided heavy bomber crews and twin-engine fighter pilots. The shoulder patch, approved in 1943, is in the Air Force colors, and the wing star is suggestive of the Army Air Forces, and the 4 golden rays indicate the unit's numerical designation. Today, the 4th Air Force is part of the Air Force Reserve Command and is headquartered at March Air Reserve Base in California, and directs the activities and supervision of our 30,000 Air Force reservist training. The 5th Air Force has a really interesting history. It was formed in 1942, but basically the 5th was originally activated as the Philippine Department Air Force in September of 1941. Almost all of the men and aircraft were lost in the defense of the Philippines after December the 7th, but some of the headquarters and flying crews were able to reach Brisbane, Australia in 1941. and they were later reconstituted and then joined with the Australian Air Force in attacking enemy aircraft and enemy ships. During World War II, the 5th fought in 13 campaigns and was credited with destroying 6,300 enemy aircraft at the cost of 2,500 aircraft lost to enemy action. In addition, it flew almost 500,000 combat sorties and dropped almost 250,000 tons of bombs on enemy targets. The shoulder patch of the 5th Air Force was approved in 1943 and is in the Air Force colors. The smallest stars are in the form of the Southern Cross, which is the area where the force received its baptism of fire. The comet design is taken from the unit's former aircraft markings, and the 3 trails of the comet represent bombers, fighters, and troop carriers. Today, the 5th Air Force is a numbered Air Force of the United States Air Force Pacific Air Forces. Its headquarters at Yokota Air Force Base, Japan, and is the United States Air Force oldest continuously serving numbered Air Force. The 6th Air Force was activated in February 1942 with headquarters at Albrook Field Balboa Canal Zone, and basically it was the Panama Canal Zone Air Force, flying defensive or anti-submarine patrols out into the Atlantic, but especially in the Caribbean. The shoulder patch is in the colors of the Army Air Force, and the galleon is suggestive of exploration and discovery, and is appropriate of the spirit of the Air Force, which is symbolized by the winged star. The 6 sides of the patch represent the unit's designation. The 7th Air Force was established in 1940 as a Hawaiian Air Force at Fort Schaefer in the territory of Hawaii. The 7th Air Force provided air defense for the Hawaiian Islands and then engaged in combat operations in the Central Pacific, where it would hit enemy forces in the Gilbert Islands, the Marshall Islands, and also the last major battle of the Pacific War, the Battle of Okinawa. And then it returned to the defense of Hawaii after the war. And just as a side note, the 7th Air Force became the primary U.S. Air Force command and control organization in South Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The 7th Air Force patch is a rather clever design. The star is the representation of the Army Air Forces, and the Arabic numeral 7 is the unit's designation. Today, the 7th Air Force is part of the United States Pacific Air Forces and is currently headquartered at Osan Air Base in South Korea. The 8th Air Force, the mighty 8th Air Force, was activated in Savannah, Georgia in January 1942 and been reassigned to England, where it became part of the American-British air offense against Germany. By December of 1944, the 8th Air Force was capable of sending out 2,000 heavy bombers and 1,000 fighter planes in a day, or a force of over 21,000 men on a single mission. By VE Day, the 8th had destroyed over 20,000 enemy aircraft and had flown over 1 million flights, with nearly 333,000 of those by heavy bombers. As a reward for its incredible fighting, the 8th was transferred to the Pacific Theater and established headquarters at Okinawa, but really didn't have much of a chance to fight the Japanese since they surrendered on August 15, 1945. The colors of the 8th Air Force are the Army Air Force colors, and the wing star is representing the Army Air Force, and the Arabic numeral 8 indicates the unit's designation. Here's a great display of an aerial gunner who served with the 8th Air Force. He has both his aerial gunner wings and his aircrew wings. His 5 air medals displayed along with some commemorative medals. But just what a wonderful display that honors his service in the 8th Air Force. Today, the 8th Air Force is part of the United States Air Force's Air Force Global Strike Command and is headquarters at Barksdale Air Force Base, Louisiana. The 9th Air Force, with 2 variations of its patches shown here, fought in World War II in both the Western Desert Campaign in Egypt and Libya, as well as the tactical fighter component of the United States Strategic Air Forces in Europe, engaging the enemy forces in France, the Low Country, and Nazi Germany. By VE Day in May of 1945, the 9th had destroyed 9,400 enemy aircraft with a loss of over 6,000 planes to enemy action. It had over 650,000 sorties and had dropped over 500,000 tons of bombs on enemy targets. The star in the patch represents the United States Army Air Force, and the Wing 9 indicates the unit's designation. Today, the 9th Air Force is headquartered at Shaw Air Force Base, South Carolina. Here is a really unique display case of a former aerial gunner in the 9th Air Force. He's got his aerial gunner wings, his aircrew wings. You'll notice that he has a special triangular badge with a bomb on it. I'll tell you about that a little later. Over on the right is his German Stalag tag, because he's got even his Caterpillar Club card showing that he had to hit the silk and bail out. And he has his Prisoner of War medal. A unique display of an airman who was shot down, captured, and survived. The 10th Air Force was a combat air force created for operations in India, Burma, and Indochina during World War II. The 10th Air Force and other Allied air units were responsible for absolutely destroying the Japanese air arms in India and the Burma theaters and flew thousands of sorties against the enemy. The colors on the patch are those of the Army Air Force, and the number 10 indicates the unit's numerical designation. Today, the 10th Air Force is part of the Air Force Reserve Command and is headquartered at Naval Air Station Fort Worth Joint Reserve Base. The 11th Air Force was established in 1941 as the Alaskan Air Force at Elmendorf Field, Alaskan Territory. It was initially part of the United States Army Air Force, and it provided air defense for Alaska during World War II and fought in the Aleutian Islands campaign. The 11th made over 7,000 offensive combat sorties and dropped over 4,000 tons of bombs on enemy targets and destroyed 113 enemy aircraft during the course of the war. Today, it is part of the numbered air forces of the United States Air Force Pacific Air Force and is headquartered at Joint Base Elmendorf, Richardson, Alaska. The 12th Air Force was activated at Bowling Field in Washington, D.C., and on your left you see an original design for the 12th Air Force patch, and then the final design on the right. The 12th Air Force participated in the initial invasion of French Morocco and Algiers, and in the first several months shot down over 400 enemy aircraft. It continued to fight throughout North Africa along with the RAF and engaged in the Mediterranean and Western Europe, especially in Italy, and provided support at Anzio and to Mark Clark's Fifth Army as it moved up the Italian peninsula. Today, the 12th Air Force is part of the Air Force Combat Command and is headquartered at its base in Arizona. The 13th Air Force was a combat air force that was activated in New Caledonia and was deployed in the Pacific Theater in World War II. It engaged primarily in operations in the South Pacific, attacking enemy forces in the Solomon Island, the Gilbert, and the Marshall Island campaigns, as well as fighting with the 5th Air Force. The 13th Air Force destroyed over 1,400 enemy aircraft, but also lost over 650 of its own planes to the enemy. It remained in the Philippines as part of a Far East Air Force after the war and was credited with participating in 11 World War II campaigns. The 13th Air Force was part of the United States Air Force Pacific and was last headquartered at Hickams Air Force Base on the island of Hawaii. The 14th Air Force was activated in March of 1943 in Kunming, China, and replaced the famous Flying Tigers. In one of its very first strikes against Japanese forces in Formosa, it destroyed over 50 enemy aircraft without losing a single plane. The Flying Tiger on the 14th patch was taken from the Flying Tigers, but there was never any official connection between the Flying Tigers and the 14th Air Force. But many members of the American Volunteer Group were commissioned and assigned to the 23rd Fighter Group, which was one of the original units of the 14th, and the use of the Flying Tigers on the shoulder patch was authorized to honor these airmen. Here is a unique display case of a pilot from the 14th Air Force displaying both his Army aviator wings and the Chinese Air Force wings, as well as a Chinese medal that was struck to commemorate their service during World War II. 14th Air Force then became a numbered Air Force of the United States Air Force Space Command and was headquartered at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. The 15th Air Force was activated in November of 1943 in Tunisia and was initially established as a heavy bombardment group and it was designed to fill in the Mediterranean theater of operations to complete the strategic encirclement of Germany and her satellites. During World War II, the 15th was credited with flying over 250,000 sorties and dropped over 300,000 tons of bombs. It destroyed over 6,000 enemy aircraft, and it suffered over 3,000 planes lost due to enemy action. Today, the 15th Air Force is part of the United States Air Combat Command and is headquartered at Shaw Air Force Base in South Carolina. The 15th was reactivated on 20 August 2020 to consolidate units of the 9th Air Force and the 12th Air Force to form a new numbered Air Force responsible for generating and presenting the Air Combat Command's conventional forces. And just so you know, shoulder patches also exist for the 16th and 18th Air Force, but it's extremely doubtful if either of those was ever worn or intended for unit use. Both of those units were organized after the Air Force had discontinued wearing shoulder patches in 1947. However, there may be some insignia out there that were made for the movies or for collectors, just so you know. The 20th Air Force was established in April 1944 and originally operated from bases in India and staging through bases in China and conducted strategic bombardment of the Japanese home islands. It relocated to the Mariana Islands in late 44 and continued the strategic bombing campaign against Japan until Japanese capitulation in August of 1945. The 509th Composite Group of the 20th Air Force conducted the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 1945, and they are the only unit in the Air Force to have ever used nuclear weapons in combat. Today, the 20th Air Force is part of the Air Force Global Strike Command, and its current headquarters is at Francis E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming. Now what I'd like to do is touch on some really unique Army Air Force patches that are not part of the numbered Air Forces, but this one of the Airborne Troop Carrier shoulder patch was not even an authorized patch. But the Airborne Troop Carrier personnel participated in every major airborne operation conducted by the United States in World War II. And to give you a particular example, they did the airborne resupply to the 101st when it was surrounded in Bastogne, and they lost 9 out of 13 planes during that day's support mission due to German attack. So the courage displayed by these men was extraordinary, and I thought we should mention their patch. Here is a really great example of the Army Air Force Senior NCO uniform, and you can see over on his left sleeve he has the Army Air Force patch, and on the right sleeve he has his combat patch, the 15th Air Force. But hey, what's that blue triangle down on his right sleeve? Well, it's a communication specialist patch, a tower between 4 flashes, and let me show you those. In 1943, the Army Air Force approved distinctive sleeve patches for technical specialists as shown by these blue triangles. In the upper left was the engineering specialist, then to the right of that was a communication specialist. The 2 to the right of that was a weather specialist. Then on the bottom, starting at the left, was a photography specialist. And then on the right was an armament specialist, the drop bomb. 3 other kind of interesting and unique unauthorized insignia. Starting on your left was a flying boot for airmen who had had to parachute from their aircraft when it was shot down. Then in the flying fish was for an airman who had parachuted into the water and had been rescued. And then the unofficial combat crew patch. It was sort of like to rub it in to people who weren't. 2 other Army Air Corps patches you may run into is on your left, the Army Aviation Cadet patch, and on your right, the Army Aviation Cadet Flying patch. Thank you for joining us today for our show on the United States Army Air Force combat patches of World War II. I hope you enjoyed it. I think you'll remember the patch that's on this navigator's sleeve. And the Air Force is still using all of these patches in one form or another. I think I've showed you some examples of that. Once again, special thanks to Peter Morgan for the information from his book, United States Military Patches. And thank you for watching. And I hope you share this with other folks. And remember, if you enjoyed it, please give us a like, even better, subscribe. It really helps us out. And see you next time on Veterans Medals Workshop.